In the fall of 2023, I moved into a charming but aging boarding house in the heart of a small New England town. The house had history. You could feel it in the creak of the floors and the faint scent of musty wood. It was the kind of place where stories seemed to live in the walls, and for the price, I couldn't say no. My landlady, Mrs. Winthrop, was a kind but peculiar woman in her 70s. She ran the house with strict rules: no loud noises after 10 p.m., no unapproved guests, and absolutely no entering other tenants' rooms. She said it was about privacy, and honestly, I respected that. There were 4 rooms rented out in total. Mine was on the 2nd floor, along with 2 others, and the 4th was on the ground floor near the kitchen. The tenants kept to themselves for the most part. I rarely saw them, but Mrs. Winthrop assured me the house was fully occupied. My first few weeks were uneventful. I liked the solitude, but every so often I felt watched. At first I thought it was just my imagination. An old house creaking at night, or the wind rattling the windows. But it wasn't just at night. Sometimes during the day, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway, only to find no one there when I checked. One morning, while making coffee, I saw a shadow flicker across the doorway to the kitchen. "Good morning," I called out, expecting one of the other tenants. But there was no reply. When I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. My stomach twisted. That evening, I asked Mrs. Winthrop about the other tenants. "Oh, they keep to themselves," she said with a tight smile. "Some folks prefer their privacy, dear." "I get that," I replied, "but I've barely seen anyone since I moved in. Are they all older, like me?" Her smile faltered for just a moment. "Yes, something like that." Later that week, I woke up around midnight to the sound of a door creaking open. My room was dark, but the faint light from the hallway seeped under the door. I froze. It wasn't my door. It was one of the others. I listened, my heart pounding, as footsteps shuffled past my room. They were slow and deliberate, heading toward the stairs. I didn't dare move. Eventually, the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was just another tenant, unable to sleep. But it kept happening. Night after night, those same footsteps. And during the day, I began to notice more peculiar things. A faint hum of a voice from one of the rooms, though I couldn't make out the words. The smell of roses lingering in the hallway, though there were no flowers in sight. The strangest part. One evening, I saw a light on in one of the rooms, the one at the end of the hall. I'd never seen anyone go in or out of it. My curiosity got the better of me. I asked Mrs. Winthrop directly about the tenant in that room. "Oh, that's Mrs. Holloway's room," she said. "She's very quiet." "Does she ever leave?" I asked. "I've never seen her." Mrs. Winthrop's expression darkened. "Mrs. Holloway is, private. She's been with me for many years. Please respect her space." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Holloway. Around midnight, I heard the familiar creak of a door. But this time, the footsteps didn't fade away. They stopped outside my door. My breath caught. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. Then, a faint knock. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knock came again, louder this time. I stared at the door, waiting for the sound to stop. Eventually, it did. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The next morning, I worked up the courage to confront Mrs. Winthrop. "I heard someone at my door last night," I said. It wasn't Mrs. Holloway, was it?" Mrs. Winthrop's face turned pale. "You didn't open the door, did you?" "No," I replied. "Why?" She let out a shaky breath. "Mrs. Holloway is no longer with us. She passed away years ago." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "But her room, I've seen the light on. I've heard. I keep the room as it was," she interrupted. "It's easier that way." Easier for who? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the suffocating weight of her words. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every sound amplified in the darkness. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. They stopped outside my door, just like before. This time, the knock didn't come. Instead, a voice, soft, fragile, and undeniably real, whispered my name. I never opened the door.